Okay, we're going to look at Federalist number 32. This is part 1. Hamilton writes, although I am of opinion that there would be no real danger of the consequences which seem to be apprehended to the state governments from a power in the Union to control them in the levies of money, because I'm persuaded that the sense of the people, the extreme hazard of provoking the resentments of the state governments, and a conviction of the utility and necessity of local administrations for local purposes would be a complete barrier against the oppressive use of such a power. Yet I'm willing here to allow, in its full extent, the justness of the reasoning which requires that the individual states should possess an independent and uncontrollable authority to raise their own revenues for the supply of their own wants. And making this concession, I affirm that, with the sole exception of duties on imports and exports, they would, under the plan of the convention, retain that authority in the most absolute and unqualified sense, and that an attempt on the part of the national government to abridge them in the exercise of it would be a violent assumption of power, unwarranted by any article or clause of the Constitution. Okay? Here they are going to talk about what they call concurrent legislation. Concurrent means at the same time. So the state governments are complaining, anti-federalists are complaining that national government says in the new constitution that is going to tax people directly and maybe gradually take away the power of the states to tax, and the states will have no revenue and the states will go broke, and gradually the national government takes over, centralizes everything, and it no longer becomes a federal system, it becomes a national system, unitary system, where the power is at the center. But here Hamilton says, no, there is no such a thing, because even in the Constitution, there are parts of the Constitution that says there are certain taxes that only federal government can ask for, and there are lots of other taxes that federal government cannot ask for or cannot stop the state governments from getting from their people. So he says there's only 2 or 3 places that federal government has the total say, total control on the taxation, and states should not mess with it. But the rest of it, he says, nowhere in this Constitution are you going to see us directly coming and saying that states have no right to tax at all. He says only there are 3 places, 3 situations, 3 cases that we say states cannot tax. And when we continue, you will see what these are. Okay, the next paragraph. An entire consolidation of the states into one complete national sovereignty would imply an entire subordination of the parts, and whatever powers might remain in them would be altogether dependent on the general will. But as the plan of the convention aims only at a partial union or consolidation, the state governments would clearly retain all the rights of sovereignty which they before had, and which were not, by that act, exclusively delegated to the United States. The exclusive delegation, or rather this alienation of state sovereignty, would only exist in 3 cases: where the Constitution in express terms granted an exclusive authority to the Union, where it granted in one instance an authority to the Union, and in another prohibited the states from exercising the like authority, and where it granted an authority to the Union to which a similar authority in the states would be absolutely and totally contradictory and repugnant. Here, repugnant means it'll go against. It won't work. It doesn't mean the same meaning that we use. It doesn't have the same meaning that it does now. I use these terms to distinguish this last case from another which might appear to resemble it, but which would, in fact, be essentially different. I mean where the exercise of a concurrent jurisdiction might be productive of occasional interferences in the policy of any branch of the administration, but would not imply any direct contradiction or repugnancy in point of constitutional authority. These 3 cases of exclusive jurisdiction in the federal government may be exemplified by the following instances. The last clause, but one in the 8th section of the first article, provides expressly that Congress shall exercise exclusive legislation over the district to be appropriated as the seat of government. Seat of government, they're talking about the capital, country's capital. This answers to the first case. The first clause of the same section empowers Congress to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. And the second clause of the 10th section of the same article declares that no state, without the consent of Congress, lay any imposts or duties on imports or exports, except for the purpose of executing its inspection laws. Hence would result an exclusive power in the Union to lay duties on imports and exports, with the particular exception mentioned. But this power is abridged by another clause, which declares that no tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state. In consequence of which, qualification it now only extends to the duties on imports. This answers to the second case. The third will be found in the clause which declares that Congress shall have power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization throughout the United States. This must necessarily be exclusive, because if each state had the power to prescribe a distinct rule, there could not be a uniform rule. Okay. Back there where it says exclusive right means national government has exclusive right, has the total right. It excludes the states from doing so. So he says there are cases which the Constitution says, he says if you look at the different sections and clauses of Article 1 of the Constitution, it says exactly what things are not permitted for states to do. Of course, it talked about imports. He said that import tax should be left for the federal government to do. Another thing is setting a uniform rule for immigration, naturalization, citizenship. Because if you had different rules, right now, if you had 50 different rules for every state, it would be chaos. So he talks about these things and he says, look, there's only 3 places that we say federal government has the total say. The rest of it, both the federal government and state governments have concurrent rule, concurrent authority. They can both tax. Now, the part that he talks about sovereignty, okay, that becomes a little complicated. So once you finish reading these papers, maybe in a different place I can talk a little bit more about this. Because remember, in another paper, it said you can't have one sovereignty over another sovereign. He says that doesn't work. One person, one government has to have the final say. But here he says, well, states have sovereignty. So that's the case. You just have to remember that when you live in America, you have dual citizenship. You're a citizen of your state and you're a citizen of the country. But when it comes to issues that need to be resolved and solved, one person, one authority has to have the final say. Okay? So the federal government, the United States government has the final say. So keep that in mind. And I put this up here again, teachingamericanhistory.org. So visit this website. There are lots of resources that can be helpful to you.